Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on the emotional practice environment, how our thoughts and mood affect injury risk. So a lot of artists don't connect those dots. They think, oh, I went into my practice session, my class, my music lesson, whatever it may be. And, I was stressed out and I kind of messed up and I didn't do as well as I thought because I was stressed out. But they might not really be connecting the dots. Actually, you can be causing yourself injury or contributing to injury due to the fact that you were in that stress state. So this talk, we're going to really pick apart the biology that's going on underneath our emotional state, and see how that's affecting the physical, because we tend to sort of think, oh, the stress stuff happens in our head and it doesn't affect actually what's happening in the body, but that's really not the case. So we're going to go through this from a more biological perspective, but also then talk about how you can use that information to address both the training and performance environments that we're in, and make sure that we're not sabotaging our own performance because of the emotional states that we're in. Okay, so I'm going to bring up some visuals here so that we can get a little handle on what's going on. There we go. So we know that dancers get injured, right? It's kind of, most people will often, if I say, oh, I help, injured performers, and they go, oh yeah, dancers, yeah, they get injured. And then I say, yeah, I work with a lot of injured musicians too. And they go, musicians get injuries? It's like they're sitting still playing an instrument. How would they get injured? But you guys who are musicians will know it's a highly physical job. And when you're dancing and moving around a space, you're actually transferring the load through the body in a much broader way. When you're playing an instrument, you're really loading certain parts of the body in a much more narrow way that can create a lot of issues. And this was a study that was done back in 2012 that looked at injury rates in musicians, and it showed that there is an 84% lifetime prevalence of injury in this was looking at classical orchestral musicians. So in dancers, we know it's anything up to 95% are injured or have experienced an injury at some point during their career, but 84% of musicians as well. But it's kind of not spoken about as much. And that's why I've pulled this particular study out. 50% of the people in that study were playing in pain at any given time, right? And a lot of people think, oh, I'm playing in pain, and they don't even consider that an injury. So when you look at that 84%, there's probably a lot more than that, people that are injured but don't consider it as such. They're just like, oh, well, my shoulder kind of hurts, but I don't think of it as an injury, right? So how we categorize things is pretty important. Less than 50% thought that they had actually completely recovered from the injury. And this is something I see a lot, that people were like, oh, well, I had this shoulder thing or this knee thing, and it kind of got better. I did a bit of treatment on it, but then I went back and it's never quite been the same since. So that sort of recurrent injury, or the old injuries that keep coming back, it's a common experience. And they found in this study that the contributing factors to pain are the training hours, like the amount of time spent training, and the load of that. So how, how many hours in one hit did you do your music practice, or how many hours were you thrashing yourself around the dance studio? So one of the things that's quite interesting to know, and what I've done when I was researching all this stuff is looked at research that doesn't actually sit within the performing arts realm, but actually can really inform what we're doing. And there was a couple of studies, there are other ones as well, but these are two I pulled out. If you want to screenshot this, you can look up those references at the bottom there. They basically looked at mental load and muscle activity. So what they did was they had little muscle sensors that you put on the sort of shoulder and arm muscles that register activity in those muscles. And then they had people, first of all, just sit and do nothing so that they could get a baseline reading of muscle activity. So this is the muscles at rest. Then they had people do some sort of mental task. So they gave them a math test to do, like count backwards from 100 in increments of 7, or, some sort of mental challenge, but they weren't physically moving. What they saw was that the activity in the muscles went up simply as a factor of increased muscle or increased mental cognition. So when the brain is given a task, muscles will tense in response to that, even though they're not being used as part of that task. So if you overlay that on your practice as a musician, vocalist, dancer, whatever it is you do, if you are running a whole load of maybe stressful thoughts in your mind, that's mental load, right? You've already got a degree of muscle tension in the system before you start picking up your instrument or you start doing your movement work. So just having too much, what I call the mind monkeys, too much mind monkey noise going on, is already increasing tension in muscles. So this can start to give us an idea of how muscles can be getting into trouble when we're loading physical activity on top of that baseline tone that's coming with the mental activity. So what's the system underneath all this that's connecting our thoughts and emotions to the physical? And it's pretty complex, as you can see by this rather messy slide, and this very, very long term psycho-neuro-immuno-endocrinology. So there's no quiz at the end of this. I'm not stressing you out further by giving you a mental challenge to learn this, but this really describes the physical connections, the tangible mechanisms that exist that connect thoughts and emotions to physical outcomes. So when you start to understand this, it seems less kind of nebulous. When we're stressed, it's often like, I'm just it's all in my head and I don't know how to handle it. When you understand it is actually a physical process that you can actually get in and intervene in, then it helps in itself to reduce your stress because you can do something about it. So let's just break this term down. Psycho, so psychological, that's our thoughts, emotions, right? Neuro refers to the nervous system. The nervous system's like the body's internet. It's the wiring messaging system that sends signals to and from the brain to all parts of the body. So when we've got thought processes going on, it actually lights up that nervous system and sends signals down through the body. So say we are stressed psychologically, that's going to switch on a certain branch of the nervous system, which we're going to get to, and that's going to send signals down to things like our immune system. That's the immuno part. So the immune system is part of our defense system. So if you are feeling stressed, you are feeling under threat. So the body's going, we're under threat, we need to defend ourselves. So it's going to go and tell the immune system we've got some stuff going on. The endocrinology part of it, the endocrine system, is our metabolic system. That's basically the system that manages the hormones in the body. Hormones are just chemical messengers, right? The nervous system sends electrical signals. The endocrine system sends hormone signals, chemical signals, things like adrenaline, right? You've heard of cortisol, stress hormones, right? They're again just a signal that goes through the body via the bloodstream to tell various organs, hey guys, we got a problem. We need to mount a response to this. So now we can start to see the architecture that exists to translate thoughts and emotions into physical outcomes. So let's have a look at that nervous system because it's the main one that can help us understand what's going on when we are stressed. So the nervous system is pretty complex, and I'm going to break it down into very sort of simple chunks here. But essentially, the central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. So the brain is a bit like the orchestra conductor that's sending signals out via the spinal cord to various parts of the body. Now, at each level of your spine, a branch comes off that cord, right and left, and goes off and branches and branches and branches and goes to all regions of the body. And that's called the peripheral nervous system because it goes to the periphery. And that peripheral nervous system also has branches. This stuff isn't very simple, but this is just a simplistic overview of it. So the branches of that peripheral nervous system include the sensory system. So this is how we read our environment, right? We're seeing things, hearing things, smelling things, tasting things. We can touch, we can register temperature change. So those are environmental signals, right? We read those. The information goes via the sensory nervous system from those organs up to the spinal cord to the brain, so that brain can respond to them. And it typically is going to respond to this sensory information via the motor system. This is the movement system in the body. It's the system that sends signals from the brain to the muscles to respond. So say if it suddenly got really cold where you're sitting, your skin is going to register that drop in temperature, sensory information. That goes to the brain. The brain says, whoa, we got to control our core temperature here, otherwise we're in trouble. So it can send signals to your muscles to make them tremor, right? To shake, to shiver. Shivering is a way to generate heat via muscle activity to bring the core temperature up. So there you can see a very obvious mechanism of sensory information in and motor information out to respond to environmental signals. Now, there's also a branch of the peripheral nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. And this is basically the body's autopilot. There's a whole bunch of things that go on in the body that we don't have to tell our body to do, right? You can breathe without micromanaging, right? Your heart will beat, your digestive system will do its job. If we had to tell ourselves to breathe in and out and our heart to beat, we'd never get anything else done, right? Those things have to be subconscious. So the autonomic nervous system runs all that stuff. Now, it has two branches. I know this is kind of a little bit detailed, but those two branches are pretty important when we're looking at our state of emotional arousal, right? So we have the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. So the sympathetic branch houses the fight or flight mechanism, or it mediates the fight or flight mechanism, which is the anxiety response, right? The stress response. The parasympathetic branch is the rest and digest system, the chill out, relax. It's the state we need to be in to go to sleep. So that's our resting state. Now, we don't want to think that we're either in one or the other. It's like a dance. We're in a dance between the two at all times, but we can often end up one end of that spectrum, if you think of it as like a long spectrum. And when you're in a sort of constantly anxious state, you're kind of in that sympathetic dominance and you're not getting as much time in that parasympathetic state, which is pretty important when we see what happens in that state in terms of body health. It's really, really important that that should be our default state, and the sympathetic should only be used for very limited purposes. It shouldn't be our default. So these are some of the things that happen when we're in that sympathetic dominant fight or flight anxiety state. So heart rate and blood pressure are going to go up, right? So we're going to mount a response. Remember, the body thinks it's under threat when it's mounting this response. So we need to get blood pumping around the system. The muscles are going to tense, right? So if you are a dancer and you are going into practice or into performance with a lot of psychological tension, that will manifest as physical tension. And then you kick your leg, you're more likely to get a hamstring injury if the muscle was tight because you were stressed, right? Same with instrumentalists. If you've got tension in that upper body from being in this state and then you're loading it with your playing, we've got increased risk of injury. Your immune system gets suppressed. So the sympathetic state is supposed to be used for short-term emergencies, right? I'm getting attacked by a bear. I need to respond to it really quickly. We need to divert all our energy to that state. But the immune system takes quite a lot of our body's overall tank of energy. So when we're in the sympathetic state, we're going to divert resources away from things that are not really immediately necessary. So the body doesn't really care if you're continuing to fight that cold that's been lurking around for you if you're about to get mauled by a bear, right? It's about priorities. Let's deal with the bear attack, switch that off. Then once we get to safety, then we can bring it back online and our immune system can go about doing its job again. So the trouble is we tend to hang out in this stress state for prolonged periods, and it was never designed for that. Our senses are heightened. That includes our sense of pain, because pain is just another sense. We saw all those senses that we had. We need to be able to read the environment, right? Figure out what's going on. So everything, it's like the volume dial goes up on everything. And we'll talk about pain a little bit more in a moment. Inflammation goes up. So the body is expecting some sort of physical attack, right? This is a primitive system designed for when we were under physical threat a lot of the time. So when we are anticipating this bear attack, one of the outcomes of that could be an open wound, right? So the body produces inflammation as a sort of preemptive strike in case we get an open wound from this terrible physical situation we're going into. But of course, we're typically not in that situation. We're just in a state of psychological threat, but we're still producing inflammation. So if you've got inflammation running around your system, not being used for purpose, it can go around and cause trouble in your muscles, in your joints. And why do I feel so much more sore after practicing today than I did the day before? What was my state of sympathetic dominance when I was practicing today? Look at it through the lens of your emotional state, and you can see, well, if I was stressed out, I've got a ton of inflammation in my system. No wonder everything's more sore, right? Again, we start to see the connection. Digestion gets switched off. So when you are stressed, again, digestive system takes a lot of our overall energy. So it gets switched off so we can divert that energy to whatever it is we need to deal with. So that means that anything we've eaten can just sit and not be processed in the way that it should be, which is why we can get digestive discomfort that goes along with being in a stressed state. So that includes saliva, or the secretions of our gastric stomach system and our digestive tract. Those all get switched off, which is why you often get a dry mouth when you're stressed. And if you're a woodwind or brass player, that can be an issue, or a singer, right? If you're getting dry mouth because you're stressed, this is why, okay? Breathing gets high and shallow, right? We tend to upper chest breathe. Not useful when you're doing something physical that requires oxygen delivery to muscles, right? So A, we're going to be more tense. B, we're going to restrict our oxygen intake, which means muscles are not getting what they need. Muscles require a lot of oxygen to function. They can function in the absence of oxygen. They can switch to a different system where they burn something called glycogen to get their energy instead of oxygen. But the outcome of that is increased waste products. So again, soreness after practice, soreness after performance in your muscles is a sign of increased waste products. If we are working in a less oxygenated state, we're more likely to get that muscle soreness. We call it the DOMS, right? Delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS. That is often a result of, it can just be purely from your physical activity, but if you're in that stress state when you're doing your physical activity, you're more likely to get that issue. Sugar is released into the bloodstream. So again, we need instant energy to fight the beast. So sugar, again, if it's not being used, causes trouble. So if we're not burning that off, if you're going into performance, then you are going to burn that off. But if you're sitting stressing out in your bedroom about the audition you've got tomorrow, and you're pumping sugar into your system because your body thinks it's under attack, that sugar's not being used. Sugar is highly corrosive to our organs, to our blood vessels. It causes problems. So our body needs to try and manage our sugar levels. And the pancreas, that's one of its main jobs. It pumps out insulin, right? You've probably heard of insulin. That is pumped into the system to bring your blood sugar levels down. But if you're in this state constantly, the pancreas can get exhausted, and then it's not producing enough insulin, and then we're into diabetic changes. That's why diabetes is known as a disease of stress, right? So again, we start to connect these dots between thought processes. They're not just thought processes. It's all this stuff, and it's affecting not only your physical performance, but your overall health as well. So inflammation, we mentioned there, we mentioned this idea that if you are under attack, you might get an open wound. So inflammation is a natural part of wound healing, right? So if you get that open wound, then inflammatory chemicals go to the site. You know, if you've ever cut your skin, you know it gets hot, red, inflamed, swollen. That's because inflammation is going there, but it's a good thing, right? It's there because it's going to fight off any bacteria that might try to invade that wound. And it's also part of the mechanism that helps to bind up the wound. Inflammation can also happen internally via muscle injury. So if you've really overdone it in your practice or performance, you've played for too many hours on your violin, or you've been, doing too many hours of dance practice in a day, and you get muscle damage, right? So when we pull a muscle, we essentially tear the muscle. Even if it's at a microscopic level, it might not be torn the whole thing, but just that little niggles in the muscles, a little tears, micro tears. They bleed just like an open wound bleeds, right? So when they bleed, you get an inflammatory response that goes into to heal up that wound. So when you talk about having knots in your muscles, you know, sometimes you say, oh, my muscles have got sort of lumps or knots in them. Muscles don't knot themselves. That's not quite an accurate term. What you're feeling is the equivalent of what happens on your skin when you get an open wound. You get a scab, right? The same thing happens in a muscle. It's trying to bind itself together and patch the leak of precious fluids that's happening internally in the same manner that it would on your skin. So that's a normal part. But if we now look at practicing in a stressed state where your muscles are more tense to begin with, so they're more prone to tearing, and you've got more inflammatory chemicals in the system anyway, then you're in a recipe for muscle injury, for an increased inflammatory response in your muscles because of the stress response. So this is another study that I found that was to do with, again, emotional stress. And it wasn't done in performing artists. It was actually just done on it was on the adolescent population, but general adolescent population. But I thought it was really, really interesting from a societal perspective, and to be able to put this into the context of the arts world. So what this study looked at was social stress and targeted rejection, and adolescents who were exposed to social stress. So this is, you know, can be peer driven. And for me, this is like the modern thing, right? Social media, who's liking you, who's, you know, bad mouthing you on social, you know, all this judgment that's around, particularly for the younger generation these days. Social stress, targeted rejection. So again, if somebody unfriends you or puts some bad comment on something you've posted, that's targeted rejection, right? So that could be also happening outside the social media context as well, just in daily life. So adolescents who are exposed to that carries health risks for adult life that are greater than those for smoking, for alcohol abuse, and for physical inactivity. That should be a wake-up call to all of us, right? Where's the warning labels for this, right? You have a packet of cigarettes, it says this can kill you. Yet we know that social stress and targeted rejection carry higher risks than that for adolescents, and this is talking about their health outcomes in later life. There's a 20-fold increase in the risk of depression. It leads to increased inflammation in the body. We just talked about that, right? And it activates areas of the brain that are involved in experiencing pain. So this is a psychological stress that is now documented to cause a physical outcome. And if you put this into the context of the arts world, and particularly to arts training, which is all about being judged, right? Going to auditions, jury panels, just being in class with your peers and everyone's judging you, auditions and the profession where it's constantly, are you good enough? Are you not? And getting rejected. No, you're not getting the job, right? We get more rejected from more jobs than the ones we get, right? So for me, this is like a huge warning sign for all of us that we need to be understanding how to manage this because of the risks it carries in just for general health, regardless of just our injury risk. And another study that, again, comes from outside the arts world, but is so relevant to us, and particularly if you are teachers working with the young arts student population. This came from the American Academy of Pediatrics, that again talks about early experiences being built into our bodies, and that significant adversity in childhood can produce physiologic disruptions and biological memories. Really interesting phrase that will undermine the development of the stress response system, make it hyperactive, right? Affect the developing brain, the cardiovascular system, the immune system, and metabolic regulatory controls. We talked about that, the endocrine system, the hormone system. And that these disruptions persist into adulthood and lead to lifelong impairments in physical and mental health. Right? So this is talking about trauma in childhood, but again, trauma is not necessarily about some, really sort of full on what we call the big T trauma events. Lots of little traumas. So just the trauma of, constantly being put up for competition and being rejected or being compared, and even sort of parental issues around particularly sort of young child prodigies, people who are showing early signs of being very good at what they do as a musician, as a dancer, whatever it is. And then they start to get pushed by parents, and be it very well meaning, well, she's really great, we're going to push her forwards. But the child starts to learn that they only have value if they are achieving to a certain level, and that their love is not unconditional, right? That if they fail or do wrong, they're going to get rejected. So this can be a messaging system that starts to develop and will have these same effects. It goes back to that sort of rejection, social stress as well. So there's a lot of overlap between these two. So we talked before about pain being increased. So anxiety, remember, pain is not, pain people tend to think is a very tangible thing. Oh, if I've got X amount of damage to a muscle, I'll get X amount of pain. It doesn't work like that. Pain is about perception. So the emotional state will affect how you perceive pain. So you probably have all experienced this. If you've got some little niggle going on in the body, some lower back pain, a hip thing, a shoulder thing going on, there may be times, and often this happens in performance, right? You go on stage and you're having a fabulous time performing and you have no concept of the injury, right? In the dance world, we used to call it Dr. Footlights, right? As soon as you get on stage under the footlights, the pain just disappears, right? And then you come off stage and 2 hours later, you're like, oh God, that back is back again, right? What's different? What's changed? Nothing's changed in your body. What's changed is the emotional environment, right? Your perception has changed. So when we are in a really kind of happy, joyful place, or in a really super chilled out place, our perception of pain goes down. Remember, pain is one of those senses we looked at. And when we go into a stress state, we need all our senses online and amplified so that we can make decisions about how to respond to the situation. So that little puppy there is a really good example of that, right? The eyes are open because we're taking in more visual information. The ears are back. We're primed and ready. And you can imagine that if you touch the puppy, as it seems someone's trying to do in that picture, you're going to get an exaggerated response, right? Everything's dialed up. And that's why often somebody will come to me with an injury and, I'll say, oh, where are you at? Sort of on a scale of 1 to 10, if, 10's really super bad and 1's no pain. Where are you? Oh, God, it's like an 8 out of 10. I'm really stressed because I've got this performance next week, and I can feel all the emotional baggage that's attached to that. When I just start talking to them, reassuring them, going, oh, it's okay, it's all right, this is not a crazy bad issue, we can take care of this, don't worry, I've seen 3 people with this already today, you're not alone. As soon as I start to manage their perception of the situation, the pain has come down. They'll be like, oh, it's only like a 6 out of 10 now. And we haven't even started any treatment at that point. It's just the emotional context has changed. Therefore, the pain has come down. Now we can get a more rational idea of how much of your pain is actually due to the tangible damage to the muscle or the joint, and how much is just amplification, just background noise that's coming from being stressed. Okay, so once we learn to get a more proportional idea of what's going on, that in itself can reduce the stress and anxiety, which reduces the pain. So again, this is an interactive system, and when we can sort of hack the emotional stuff, we're also hacking the biology at the same time, and we can intervene at any point in that cycle. So one of the things that also drives this sort of stress response, why is it that people are in this sort of stressed out state a lot of the time? And a lot of it comes down to how we motivate ourselves. I always say to artists, do you remember the first time you picked up your instrument that you now play, or the first time that you went to a dance class, or the first time that you just sang at home, for the joy of it? You didn't care what it sounded like. Most people, the first instrument they get is a recorder, right? And you drive everyone nuts by just blowing on the thing, and you're just so excited that you can blow into something and make all this sound, and you can find a piano and just bash it with your hands and make noise. It was joyful, right? I can move around the room and fling myself around. There's no judgment involved. You don't care if anyone thinks you have a good technique or not. That's intrinsic motivation. You do it because it makes you feel good. You get a joy from it. So there's nothing outside of you that's driving that. However, then when we start to go, oh, well, now we're going to ballet class, or now we're going to start to learn our instrument more formally, and we start to put external judgment upon it. Oh, no, well, this is a bad sound. This is a good sound. You need to sound like this. That microtone above it, that's a bad sound. This is the one you need to make. We start to change our motivation to a more external, what we call extrinsic motivation. And this is more the sort of carrot and stick approach. So you start to want to achieve because you either are seeking reward. Oh, well, my parents are going to be really pleased if I get a good grade in this violin exam, or if I get a good part in the school production, I'll get applause. My teacher will be pleased with me if I achieve the benchmark that they've set. So we start to outsource our motivation to either achieving reward or avoiding punishment. I've got to do really well, otherwise my parents are going to yell at me, or my teacher's going to yell at me, right? So either seeking reward or avoiding punishment are external. They are beyond our control. Guess what happens when we're in a state where something is beyond our control? We go into defense mode physiologically, right? So if you are externalizing your achievement to something outside of yourself, you are by definition in a stressed state with everything that we've seen that goes with it. versus I'm going to do my absolute best and I'm going to really enjoy doing it. And if it doesn't work out, I can let it go. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm not, worried about whether my teacher will yell at me. That's their problem, not mine, right? That's intrinsic motivation. Not easy to get at. But again, a lot of our training in the arts is driven more towards this fear-based approach of, you gotta do it again, it's a tough profession, so we have to yell at you and beat you into submission during your training to toughen you up so that you can weather the vagaries of this very, very competitive profession. Well, does endless competition breed a good competitor? Well, the research around that says absolutely not. The thing that you need when going into a highly volatile, vulnerable profession is good self-esteem. That comes from intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. Go and check out my talks on perfectionism if you want to know more about that stuff. Okay, so what are the things that we can sort of look out for? What are the warning signs, particularly maybe if you're a teacher working with students and you want to know when are they getting, when are they in that state or not? And we have a kind of couple of different buckets that people can fall into. Stress doesn't manifest in one simple way in everyone. Everyone has a slightly different version of it. But there are sort of two broad categories that tend to show up. So one of them is that top left kitten, which is the sort of fight or flight that we just looked at, right? The hyper-vigilant. So somebody's very, very edgy, and if you said their name in class, they jump, and everything seems to be very, very, dialed up. And so we call this hyper-vigilance. Remember, all those sense organs are online. That comes with a lot of physical tension. So somebody who's playing their instrument with it just seems like a lot of extra work, right? Can we let that go and play? Complaints of muscle soreness above usual, it's so if someone keeps coming in and saying, oh, my shoulder's still bad, that's a sign that they're in this sympathetic state for prolonged periods, and it's leading to muscle soreness. It could just be their technique or other things. But again, you've got to look at this as another layer, another piece of that jigsaw. Then you've got sort of the opposite one. So some people's response to stress is to actually kind of want to curl up and hide. So they withdraw, they become less communicative. So you might find that a student that, a couple of weeks ago was kind of chatting to you and seemed to be, quite happy. And now suddenly they become monosyllabic, they're just like, I don't know, they're not really communicating with you, not making eye contact. So changes in behavior, and maybe their skill level has kind of dropped back, and you're thinking, oh, okay, I thought we were on track to reach this benchmark and now we've dropped back, rather than go, you haven't practiced enough, right? Is it that there's something else going on? So these are little signs that we can see in others or see in ourselves that might lead us to believe that we're perhaps not in as chilled out a state as we might like to be. It's important to kind of assess which bucket you're falling into or which bucket your student is falling into, because the management strategies for each of those are slightly different. So if they are that person who's kind of super stressed and very agitated and very reactive to things, then actually they need isolation. Say you're somebody who gets performance anxiety, or you get anxious before you go into a practice studio even. If you are that sort of hypervigilant type, or you have that sort of hypervigilant type response, you're actually best to just go and find somewhere quiet to be on your own, right? Because people around you, you get a bit like the puppy in the previous picture. You're like, if somebody touches you, suddenly it's like, rather than before you'd be like, oh, they just nudged me, right? So isolating yourself is a good thing to do. Find a calm place. You basically want to reduce the stimulation, that sensory information that's around you. Maybe, it's like some people like to just listen to, their iPod or something before they go into performance mode or into practice mode. Just take themselves out of the real world for a moment and let yourself dial down. And then you can use some breath work and things in that, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that's the general thing you want to do, isolate. However, if you're in that other bucket where you just kind of are curled up in a ball and you don't want to engage with anyone, then the way out of that is the opposite. If you go and isolate yourself when you're in that mode, you're going to circle the drain, right? You're going to just reinforce that thing and deepen it. So what you need to do is actually come into connection, that you need someone to bring you into connection. Eye contact can be really good. Hey, how are you? You know, if you see somebody like that, you want to reach out to them and say, hey, are you doing okay? You know, get them to look at you, bring them into the group, include them in a non-threatening way. So again, if you're somebody who goes into that kind of category before performance or before practice, then you kind of need to train your fellow cast members or company members and say, look, if you see me kind of checking out like that, can you just come and just, you know, pull me back into the group? So you can get your group, either if you're a student, your fellow students, or if you're in a you know, an orchestra or a rock band or a musical theatre production, get your fellow cast members to, you know, you can work with each other and say, I can see when you go into that sort of state, so I'm going to be the one to come in and help you. Or if I see you're like super anxious like this, I'm going to just leave you alone because I know you need to isolate. So train the people around you. And if you're a teacher, again, you can see those different sort of, you know, responses coming in your students, and you can approach them in different ways so that you don't trigger them further, because that's the last thing we want to do, is being very well meaning but actually doing the wrong thing. So some strategies for teachers, or it could be if you're a, you know, choreographer, director, somebody who runs a dance company, or you know, in charge of a music group. How can we create a good environment to help manage this stress response? So really it's about having an environment of openness, that people don't feel afraid to talk about this stuff. So if they're feeling stressed out, that they know that they can come to you and say, hey, look, I'm really not doing well at the moment. Put it on the table, say, look, I want you to come and talk to me. Don't feel like it's a burden or an imposition. If you want to share what's going on, create, you know, times where people can sit and share, so that it just means that it doesn't become, you know, there's so much code of silence in our profession where we hide injuries and we hide our emotional states for fear of rejection or whatever. We've got to change that. It's past its due date now, right? Again, if you're a teacher, if people are not sort of meeting anticipated benchmarks, question the bigger picture. Don't just immediately assume that they're not practicing. It may be that they're not practicing, but there could be a reason why they're not practicing, because they're terrified they're going to mess up. You know, there is this whole thing, the perfectionism thing, that if you actually do the practice, you might show up your own failure. So then they avoid the practice for that reason. It's not because they're being lazy. You know, this is multi-layered stuff. And because it's multi-layered stuff, you have to recognize your scope of practice. If you're not a trained psychological practitioner, then you want to be mindful of not, you know, overstepping your bounds. So I always recommend to build relationships with other professionals, with, you know, a counselor, psychotherapist, you know, with medical practitioners, with, you know, physical therapists, so that you can say, you know, and I would, even if you were a teacher, get those people to come in and give a talk. You know, if you don't understand stress, you know, in very great detail, have someone who does come in and give a talk to your students and to you. Educate yourselves on these things, but don't wait until things go wrong. Build relationships so that then if a student is having problems, you can say, well, you know, that nice person that came in and gave us that talk, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. And then it doesn't seem quite so scary as well. And of course, practice what you preach as well. It's no good telling everybody else to manage their stress if you're not doing the same, right? We have to come from a place of authenticity. One of the other strategies I always talk about is, you know, let's put the emotional baggage aside before we start practicing or going into performance, because of all the reasons we've seen, all the things that's happening physically in our bodies when we're going into performance or practice is going to increase injury risk. So we need to have a mechanism of let it go. So I always say to musicians and dancers, in the studio, in the practice room, there's normally a trash can there, right? So you walk in the door and you're like, okay, what am I carrying with me that is not going to be useful to my practice today? Let's put all that in the trash can and say, and I'm not saying just to sweep everything that you're going through under the rug, right, and ignore it. That's not good either, right? Negative experiences are there to teach us something. They are there to be addressed and to be worked through, but we don't need to carry the physical expression of that into something. Often for performers, playing the instrument, singing, dancing is the stress release, right? But if you're carrying the thought processes into that, it's going to have, a less effective result. So being able to shed the physicality of what's going on before you pick up your instrument, before you start your movement practice, is a really good thing. And say, okay, I'm going to find a time to deal with that. I'm not ignoring it, but I'm not going to carry it into my practice today. So this brings us on to what can we do, right? We've talked about that sympathetic state a lot, but what's happening with the parasympathetic state, the rest and digest state? This is the state that we need to be in to get all the repair. And of course, we're not going to perform in a completely chilled out state. We need that sympathetic system to be online, but we do need to recover in a parasympathetic state. And if you are somebody who practices all day, performs at night, and it's all done in stress, and then you come home and you worry about practicing and performing the next day, and you never give yourself the downtime, you're not able to repair any of the damage that is happening during that performance. And you're not getting yourself out of that inflammatory state. And therefore, it's going to have an accumulative effect. And we talked about that earlier, about how often injuries become ongoing and keep recurring further down the line because you never really address them. So these are the things that happen in that parasympathetic state. So it's basically the reverse of what we looked at in the sympathetic state. Heart rate and blood pressure can come down. Yay. Muscles can relax. Your breathing can go back into a normal pattern. That digestive system comes back on. Remember, if you've been running your body at a high level, you need repair and reparative and restorative foods. And if you're eating and your digestive system is switched off, you're not absorbing. So you're not getting that nutrition. Even if you have the best diet in the world, if your digestive system is offline because you're stressed, you're not getting the benefit of it. So you need recovery foods, but you also need a system that's online to receive them. The social engagement system is back online. Remember, when we're in that stress response, you're either like hypervigilant or you're checked out. You're not what we call socially engaged. So particularly in the sort of teacher-student relationship, we need to have social engagement online. It needs to be a safe place for communication to happen, and within casts and companies in the professional world. So that's only really there when we're in the parasympathetic state. That immune system can come back online, right? We talked about that being suppressed. So, if you're a vocalist and you've got a big performance coming up and you can feel, oh, I've got that tickly sore throat coming on, you need your immune system online to deal with that so that it's not going to affect your performance. But if you're stressing about it, it's the reverse, right? You're actually sabotaging your ability to address any inflammation that might be going on. And we've mentioned growth and repair taking place, right? We've got to mop up after what we put our bodies through. That only happens in this state. So how do we get there? Many, many different ways we can look at that. If you want to know more about stress management, I've got a whole course on it that goes into detail of routines and practices you can engage in to help with stress management. I'm just going to talk about breathing here because it's one that we can really do without anybody else noticing. You don't need to stop and take 20 minutes out to breathe, right? You're doing it all the time. You can just adjust how you're breathing to be able to hack this system. So the diaphragm is that main muscle of in-breath, right? The big dome-shaped muscle in the middle of our body. And as we breathe in, that diaphragm's going to flatten downwards, and as we breathe out, it domes back upwards. And so it has this big movement effect. So as it flattens downwards, it creates the space in the lungs above for the air to come in, but it also massages the abdominal organs and helps with digestion, right? So this is a good two-way system that helps on many levels. So some of the other benefits of breath work, when we're in that shallow breathing mode, right, which happens when we're stressed, then you're not going to bring in as much oxygen, right? Because you're not taking in a full tank. You're only top up breathing. When we take a deep breath, we bring much more oxygen into the system. We've already talked about how important that is for muscle use. But if you've got less oxygen in your system because you're shallow breathing, your heart rate has to go up to pump what's needed round to the muscles more quickly, right? When you take a deep breath in, you've got more oxygen in the system, your blood oxygenation levels go up, then the heart rate doesn't have to go so high, right? Because the system is more what we call saturated with oxygen. So this is why deep breath work brings the heart rate and therefore the blood pressure down. It increases immunity, okay? Oxygen is very important for our immune system because a lot of bacteria and things don't do well in oxygen-rich environments. So the more oxygenated the system, the better you are from an immune perspective, but also because it draws you into that parasympathetic state, it gets that immune system online again. It's going to reduce inflammation. Again, more oxygen in the system helps to reduce inflammation. It helps your muscles to relax. It improves lymphatic drainage. Our lymphatic system is part of the body's kind of cleaning mechanism. It cleans out, again, a lot of cellular debris. And again, when you've been exercising a lot, there's a lot of waste products in the system. They need to be cleaned out via the lymphatic system. The diaphragm is the main pump for your lymphatic system. If you ever get swollen ankles or swollen joints after exercise, that's often a sign of reduced lymphatic drainage. I want to know immediately, what is your breath pattern like? Are you only shallow breathing? It improves digestion, as I mentioned. It helps to massage the digestive tract and helps to move food through the system. It's going to stimulate your vagus nerve, which is the main nerve of the parasympathetic system. And when you're bringing more air into your lungs, I mentioned earlier about vocalists in particular worrying about throat infections or colds, things like that. When you deep breathe, you draw the air all the way down to the bottom part of the lungs. You're not just in your top up mode. There's always air in the lungs. You know, they're never completely empty, but what can happen is the air at the bottom of the lungs can become stagnant. It's not exchanging because you're not drawing the fresh air all the way down. So taking a deep breath draws the air right down to the bottom of the lungs and cleans out the dirt, right? So stagnant air is like stagnant water. It's a breeding ground for bacteria, right? So house cleaning, deep breathing is good house cleaning for the lungs. So it's going to protect against infection. So I'm going to talk about two different techniques for breath here, because again, we need to look at what is the outcome that we want. If you want to super chill out because you want to go to sleep, for instance, or you just want to have some downtime, some rest time, you want to prepare yourself for eating, let's say, because we need to be in a parasympathetic state to receive our food, then this is a good technique. It's not such a good technique if you're about to go into class or into training or on stage. So I'll talk about a separate technique for that in a moment. But this is our kind of chill out mode. So when we take our in-breath for this technique, you want to allow your abdomen to fully expand. When we're stressed, we tend to brace the abs inwards, right? We guard our body. So if you try this, if you suck your belly button towards your spine, hold it there and try and take a deep breath in, you meet a lot of resistance. That diaphragm is trying to move downwards, but there's a whole load of internal organs beneath it, right? And your abdominal muscles are pushing those organs inwards and there's a resistance. Now, if you completely let your abdomen go soft, put your hand on it, Take a deep breath and allow the abdomen to expand, the abdominal muscles to relax. You find you can bring a much deeper, juicier, more elastic breath in. That's the one that's going to draw that air right down to the lower parts of the lungs and allow that massaging effect of the abdominal organs, which include the digestive tract. So that's the quality of your in-breath. When you breathe out, what we want is for the exhale to be twice as long as the inhale. So if you breathe in for the count of 2, you breathe out for the count of 4. It's the exhale that brings us into parasympathetic dominant state. That's why a sigh kind of feels relaxing, right? It's an out breath. So in for 2, out for 4, in for 3, out for 6. You can time that any way you like, whichever suits you. If you are a vocalist or a woodwind or brass player, you'll probably be, in for 12, out for 24, because you've got good breath control. But practicing that double length exhale is a really, really useful thing. Make sure we're not pumping the shoulders and chest up and down with the breath. Put one hand on your chest, one hand on the abdomen. Let the abdomen do the moving, not the chest, right? This brings us into sympathetic mode. So keep the chest still. Great to use before eating, right? We want to open up the digestive system to receive the food. Great before you want to go to bed or when you just want to bring those stress levels down. And you can do this really quietly. Nobody needs to know you're doing it. It doesn't have to be some great yogic noisy breath, right? It can just be something you're timing out yourself under your breath, literally, so that it's you can do it outside the door of your practice room. You can do it in the wings before you go on stage. But this version we want to reserve for when we want to completely chill out. If you are about to go onto stage, you can use your breath technique, but let's use this version instead. So this is one that brings us into what we call a state of coherence, right? So when we go into super chill out mode, we're really not thinking. That's kind of the point, right? You don't want to be going to sleep thinking about things, the mind monkeys again. We want to be chilled out. When we're about to go on task and go into training, go into performance mode, then we need to be in a state of coherence. So we're not actively stressed, but we are clear and coherent. And this is something that comes from the studies of heart rate variability. I'm a heart math practitioner. If you've heard of the Heart Math Institute, I've put their website down at the bottom there. Go and check them out. They've got some really good resources for managing heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is like the elasticity of your heart rate. So just like as a musician or a dancer, you need your muscles to be flexible and adaptable. As a dancer, you need your muscle to be able to reach and stretch to quite an extreme proportion, but it also needs to generate some power, right? So we need elasticity in the system. If you don't have an elastic muscle, it's going to snap much more easily, right? The same is true of our heart rate. When we are stressed, frustrated, the heart rate variability, which is the measure from one heartbeat to the next heartbeat. This is not your natural heart rate. This is the variability between. It's called the beat to beat ratio. When we're stressed out, typically, if we hook you up to a heart rate monitor, we'll see this very kind of jaggedy line going on. This is an incoherent, messy kind of signal that's going on. When we're in coherence, we get this lovely equal sine wave. Your peaks and your troughs are the same, and they're a much wider range so that you can adapt. If you needed your heart rate to go up really high, it could, but it can equally come down as low. It has elasticity in the system. The jaggedy ones tend to be in a very narrow band, so they can't really expand and react and respond to the environment around us. We need to be flexible and adaptable physically and emotionally. So in order to achieve more coherence, so if you're about to go into performance or into class and you want to be clean and online, then for this, we're going to focus the breath rather than focusing on the abdomen that we were looking at before. You're going to focus to your heart. And a good kind of image I use for this is, imagine you've actually got your nostrils you've got two nostrils right over your heart, so right in the middle of the chest here. And as you breathe in, you're going to draw that air straight into the heart. So when you do this, again, you can choose your counts that you use for this. But what we're going to do now is actually have an equal in-breath and out-breath. Okay, so rather than the breathe in for 2, out for 4, we're going to breathe in and out for the same amount. So we typically say for 5 seconds, because if you do sort of 6 rounds of this, you'll be at a minute, right? You can do a 1-minute coherence technique. So in for 5 and out for 5, in for 5 and out for 5. And so it's literally like you're following that lovely sine wave there, that you're going in for 5 and out for 5. As you do that, what you want to do is use some visualization here. As you breathe in, you want to really breathe in what we call a regenerative thought. So something like gratitude, appreciation, something that's a renewing thought rather than a, oh my God, I'm stressed out thought, right? So breathe in appreciation or gratitude for something in your life. Doesn't matter what it is, can be the tiniest little thing. My coffee was just really, really lovely today. I appreciate that, right? So breathe in for 5, and then so you're breathing in that thought. As you breathe out, send that thought out to the world around you, right? You are a performer. You are about communication. What is it you're communicating to your audience? If you go on stage in a stress mode, you're communicating stress, right? So draw in a nice renewing emotion, and on your out breath, send that out to the world. So that equal in-breath, out-breath technique brings you into a state of coherence. So it'll chill you out, but not to the point that you're kind of relaxed at the beach kind of mode. It'll bring you to a point where you're like, oh, okay, I'm kind of clear. I feel clarity. I'm not stressed, but I'm also ready for performance. Okay, so that's a coherence technique. So there's a couple of little options for you. There are many other ways to manage this. We've got a short amount of time here, so I'm just kind of giving you these two because they're quick and easy to do. No one needs to know you're doing them. So hopefully that's helped you to just get a broader lens through which to view any injury or pain that you might be experiencing in performance. Don't just think about what did I do technically or choreographically, or which repertoire was I doing that might have caused that. Look at the emotional context in which that occurred, that stiffness, pain, whatever it is. Why did a particular bit of choreography work one day and not the next? What was the emotional context? So once you start to look at it through that lens, it gives you a much broader perspective and many different ways of how to manage it, and actually might provide you with it's like, well, I've addressed all the technique. I don't know why it's not working still. I haven't addressed the mind monkeys around it. So hopefully you can now view everything you do through this different perspective, not just your practice and performance modes, but everything you do in life. When we're looking at stress, you can't make it context specific, right? Well, I'm only going to be chilled out when I'm, lying down reading a book. I'm only chilled out when I'm doing my breath work. Bring those sensations and feelings into your practice. You have to contextualize them, put them into practice, so that we end up with something that is online and useful to us in the moment. And it's not just, well, I'll be stressed out when I'm practicing or performing, but I'll do my yoga later and undo it. That's not the way it works. So we need to bring those skills into our daily practice in order for them to be contextualized. So I hope that's been useful. If you want to go deeper into any of these topics, I have further talks and broader courses, but I also love to hear from you guys about what you want to know. send me a message and say, I'd love to do a course on this topic, or can you work with me on this? And I'll create that content for you. So become a co-creator with me. So I hope that's been useful to you, and I wish you best of luck on your journey to a more stress-free relationship with your craft.